In this video, we're going to take a look at some common scoping mistakes and how you can try to avoid them. Some of this stuff was covered in the scope and code of conduct video, so I'll try not to repeat myself too much, but we'll basically go through what the common mistakes are, and then some of the vulnerabilities that are typically out of scope in bug bounty, and then we'll take a look at some examples on the Intigriti platform. So the first mistake is not thoroughly reading the scope before testing. You want to familiarize yourself with exactly what assets are in scope for testing and what vulnerabilities the program is looking for. Once you've done that, you want to make sure you very strictly follow that scope. Don't start looking for out-of-scope vulnerabilities or intentionally testing on out-of-scope assets. You should also have some understanding of the importance of scope. So I'll not go through this all again. We talked about it in the last module, but there are legal, practical, fairness, and focus reasons for defining a scope. Another common mistake is putting too much focus into which assets are in scope and forgetting which kind of bugs are out of scope. So we'll talk about this more later, but there are various bugs that you'll very rarely see in scope on bug bounty programs. And there are sometimes bugs which you might see a lot in bug bounty, but are specifically out of scope for certain programs. So it's very important that you make sure you know exactly what assets are in scope, but also what kind of vulnerabilities the program is going to accept. You shouldn't assume that all subdomains are in scope if they're not explicitly mentioned. And in the last module, we talked about some examples where we looked at scope precedents. For example, the most specific one is the one you should follow. I think the example that we looked at had a wildcard, so it's saying basically any subdomain. But then if you look at out of scope, it has one specific subdomain out of scope. And because that is more specific, i.e. it's not a wildcard, it's given a specific subdomain, that will take precedence. It's very common for websites to use third-party services, but of course you need to check the scope to see whether those services are eligible for testing. It's not enough just to read and understand the scope. You need to make sure that any tools are correctly configured to adhere to that scope. So let's say you've identified which domains are in scope, and you go and try to add those to Burp Suite because you want to exclude any traffic that's not in scope. However, if you don't set it up properly, or maybe you're not aware of how the scope regex works, you might inadvertently start testing things that are out of scope. And that's not just for Burp Suite, that applies to subdomain enumeration tools, for example. You want to make sure that whatever you're enumerating is within the defined scope. The final mistake is reporting out of scope findings. So we talked about this in the last module, but no bounty will be awarded for out-of-scope findings. So if you find a vulnerability on an out-of-scope asset that you shouldn't be testing, and you do report it, you can't expect a bounty for that, and actually, it's likely to lead to a lower reputation, which can mean less private invites and things like that. So it's very important to stay within the scope. If you do inadvertently find something, then it is possible to report it, but again, no bounty will be awarded in those cases, as we don't want to incentivize testing out of scope for the reasons that we outlined in the previous video. Okay, so let's talk about some commonly out of scope vulnerabilities. Hackers with a background in pen testing are often quite surprised that the security issues they'd report on a pen test might not be in scope in bug bounty. Basically, there's a common theme that you should look out for, which is security impact. Always ask yourself, if an attacker exploits this vulnerability, what impact will it have on the business or the users? Apart from that, remember, a valid bug is not always a security issue. Physical attacks fall outside of the scope because they involve physical access to hardware or facilities. Social engineering, or phishing, involves manipulating individuals, which is not the primary focus of bug bounty programs. They concentrate on identifying technical vulnerabilities. Although social engineering is quite common in red teaming and pen testing, it's pretty much always out of scope for bug bounty. If you want to hear about some examples where it has been in scope, go and listen to the recent talk by Corbin Leo and the Hamsec at DEF CON 31. They did a talk talking through some war stories in bug bounty, and one of them was a case where I believe a casino allowed phishing in scope, but only on 200 employees, and it didn't go well for the company. Denial of service attacks can lead to service disruption for all users, potentially causing harm or inconvenience, which is not the goal of a bug bounty program. Outdated or unsupported software versions might have known vulnerabilities, but may still be excluded from the scope as they're not actively maintained or may not accurately reflect the target's current security posture. However, if you find a vulnerability related to outdated software and can demonstrate the security impact, then you can report it. So for example, it's not enough just to run an Nmap scan and find some outdated software and say, oh, this has CVE attached to it. Maybe there are some other factors which you're unaware of. Maybe that vulnerability isn't exploitable in this scenario. Maybe exploiting that vulnerability would have zero security impact on the organization or the users. So again, it's not necessarily a case of that outdated or vulnerable software not being eligible for a bounty, but you basically need to prove the security impact. Another common mistake that beginners make in bug bounty is reporting missing HTTP headers or cookie flags, which can be a valid security concern, but it's often considered very low impact and excluded from the bug bounty program's scope. On the other hand, if a missing HTTP header allows you to carry out an attack, that's a different story. So again, let's say there is an issue with the content security policy and you're able to leverage that to exploit some vulnerability and demonstrate a security impact. That is something worth reporting, but simply saying, oh, this header is missing is not likely to be accepted by a bug bounty program. Brute force attacks are very often out of scope and can potentially disrupt services and lock out legitimate users. So again, be very careful to check the scope before trying to brute force any login credentials. Similarly, username enumeration, or the ability to determine valid usernames on a system, is considered very low impact and may not pose a significant risk on its own. And this is something that I had a hard time coming to terms with when I started looking at bug bounty programs. Maybe you'll go to a forgotten password link and you enter in an email and it confirms whether that is a valid user. Really, what they should do is respond with some generic message like, if this account exists, then a password reset link has been sent to the email address. That way, there's no way that any attackers can enumerate the users or the email addresses and build up a list of valid users that they can then brute force the passwords on. They might have some very valid reasons for doing this. For example, maybe they don't really care if people can find the users because they have good protections in place to prevent brute force of passwords. So maybe you can only enter your password 3 times before you get locked out. Maybe there's some good rate limits in place, or maybe it's just not an issue that they are particularly interested in at the time. And again, although this is very commonly out of scope, it's not always out of scope. So there are some scenarios where this is very important. For example, maybe with healthcare applications where the privacy of users and their names or email addresses is of significant importance. Fingerprinting techniques, which involves identifying specific technologies or software versions, are usually excluded from the scope as they don't represent direct security vulnerabilities, but rather provide information that could potentially be used in further attacks. So again, let's say you do some fingerprinting, you find out all the software versions. Simply providing that information is not a vulnerability, but maybe you can use that information to find some vulnerabilities that are worth reporting. Again, just think about the security impact. Is there a security impact from knowing the version of software, or do you need to show that you can actually exploit that? Theoretical attacks that have little or no real-world impacts, like open redirects or self-XSS, are often excluded from bug bounty programs as they don't pose a significant security risk. However, if you can chain an open redirect with another vulnerability, or if you can turn that self-XSS into an XSS that leads to an account takeover, that's a very different story. Finally, we have leaked credentials. So using credentials acquired from the dark web, for example, is typically out of scope as it involves unauthorized access to data and doesn't demonstrate the discovery of a technical vulnerability. So I've jumped over to the Intigriti knowledge database for some clarification on that last point. This is an article by Inti on reporting leaked secrets and credentials. And you can quite often go to the Intigriti knowledge database to find out more information if you're confused about whether something is in or out of scope. And this talks about different credential types. So for example, you might report some personal passwords, access tokens, or credentials which belong to an individual user or employee. These are quite often out of scope for vulnerability reporting programs if there's no clear actionable path to prevent the leaks. So it could be a third-party leak, it could be a malicious insider who has leaked that stuff from the dark web, it could be somebody who's brute forced the credentials, and again, these are typically out of scope in bug bounty. However, application secrets, so credentials that aren't tied to a specific individual, and maybe the only way to programmatically gain access to certain resources, these are typically in scope for bug bounty programs. And also, if there is a weak credential, for example, maybe you've guessed the credential is admin admin, that again is typically in scope for a bug bounty program. Whether or not something is in scope and whether or not you'll get a bounty or some reputation points will depend on the leak cause, the leak source, and the type of credentials that were leaked. So I'll not read through this full article, you know where it is, and if you find some leaked secrets or credentials, you can go and refer to the knowledge database to clarify whether or not you should report it and whether you're likely to receive a bounty. So finally, I promised we'd look at a couple of examples on the Intigriti platform. So I've opened up the Redbull program. As you can see, it's public, it's open, we can read through the description, and we'll find that there aren't actually any bounties for this. It's a vulnerability disclosure program, but you can win Redbulls. You can also then have a look at the rules of engagement. So this is the first thing we'll do before we actually start hunting. And we'll find that if we register an account, we need to use the intigriti.me email address, which is basically an alias for whatever email address you signed up to the platform with. If you enter this, then it should forward any emails to this address, which will be your Intigriti username at intigriti.me, to whatever email address you signed up with. You also need to set any tools to a max of 5 requests per second, so make sure you look at the documentation on how to do that. And in this case, you don't need to provide a custom user agent or request header, so sometimes you'll need to set a specific header to basically let the program know that you are an authorized researcher. So if you don't have this user agent set or this request header where it's required, then you might get a ping from somebody in Intigriti asking if you are currently testing on the website and why you're not using the header. This basically allows the security teams to work out what is a valid attack and what is somebody trying to help secure the organization. All right, so we know what the rules are. We also have some promises to adhere to, so we're told to make sure we focus on quality over quantity, include a clear attack scenario, don't discuss vulnerabilities online, or add your proof of concept videos to YouTube or something like that. Don't use automated scanners. We've also got some information about automated tooling, so it forbids us from using tools that enumerate domains due to the huge amount of requests that stresses the DNS, and only the above mentioned list, so we can look through that again. If you follow these rules, it means you have safe harbor, which basically gives you legal protection. You won't be prosecuted for any actions that you take as long as you stick to the scope and stick to the requirements of the program. Okay, and finally, we are down to the in-scope domains, and you don't see much here, the reason being that they've actually included all of the domains on a separate list, which you can access on GitHub. So it says that any domains other than the ones in this list will be out of scope, so that's nice and simple. You can literally just paste all of these domains into Burp Suite, and bear in mind that there are other scope settings in Burp Suite, so just because you add these to the scope doesn't necessarily mean that traffic that isn't in scope will be hidden, or that it won't automatically crawl some other sites, so just be very careful about what kind of configuration you can use in Burp Suite. And similarly, you could put these domains into other tools as long as you stick to that 5 requests per second requirement. And this keeps things very simple. You don't need to worry too much about what is in and out of scope because this is all in scope, everything else is out of scope. And we also have some Android and iOS applications, which doesn't seem to have a list. So we would probably need to just go and have a look at the out of scope section to see if there's any other information. And it does say here that all of the domains we saw above are in scope. Everything below is out of scope, and it specifically says that this NewYorkRedbulls.com is out of scope, so bear that in mind. And any subdomain not mentioned in the list of in-scope assets. So don't start enumerating subdomains. You already know what all of the valid subdomains for testing are. You should also ignore any findings related to Jira. You should ignore information disclosure, so PHP info, files, and directories that don't have any sensitive information. So again, what's the security impact? Yeah, you've brute forced some directories on the server, and maybe you found an admin directory and you think, oh, I'll go and report that. Well, what is the security impact? Are you able to access the application as an admin? Or are you able to go into an admin panel and start deleting users or viewing files? Or have you just simply found a directory that's called admin? And as it said above, we need to limit to 5 requests per second, avoid enumerating domains, as we've already been given all of the valid domains that we can test. We should ignore findings that relate to outdated Swagger versions, and they're not interested in cache poisoning related issues either. And again, down onto the application side, we see a lot of things that are out of scope. You probably see some things here which we mentioned in the presentation, but there are a lot more. You might think, how do I remember all of these things are out of scope when I'm testing? And you'll find that some of these things are so commonly out of scope that eventually you just know not to test for them unless you specifically see them as in scope. We have broken link hijacking, WordPress enumeration. So again, we talked about username enumeration, pre-auth account takeover, self-XSS. Again, we mentioned that. If it can't be used to exploit other users, what is the security impact? Any verbose error messages, for example, which don't disclose any sensitive information. So if you find some issue, maybe there's a login form, you enter an apostrophe, and there's some SQL error that pops up. Well, unless that has some credentials in it or other sensitive information, that's not worth reporting, but it's probably a sign that there might be some other issue that you can look for, like SQL injection, which is very likely to be accepted. We've got cause misconfiguration on non-sensitive endpoints and missing cookie flags and security headers, which we talked about. Again, these might be useful for finding and exploiting a vulnerability, but on their own, there is no security impact. Cross-site request forgery with no or low impact, presence of autocomplete attribute, reverse tab napping, bypassing rate limits or non-existence of rate limits. That's something that we get reports on quite often. Somebody will say we're able to brute force passwords on accounts and there's no rate limiting in place. So again, it's very likely that the organization already knows about that and they may have valid reasons for not adding rate limiting. Maybe they've got security protections in other areas which mitigate that. And again, maybe it's just not something they're interested in. They already know about it and they don't need to pay somebody to remind them that they don't have rate limiting in place. Best practice violations. So again, if you're a pen tester, maybe you'll pen test a website and see, oh, this site allows you to have a password which is only 6 characters long. That's something worth reporting to them. But again, in bug bounty, it's very likely that they're not going to be interested in that. We've got clickjacking without proven impact, TSV injection, sessions not being invalidated. So if there's no auto logout after a period of time, if there's no two-factor authentication in place, again, these are all things that organizations should have. It's good security practice, but it's not in scope typically for bug bounty. Also, tokens leaked to third parties, anything related to email spoofing, content injection without being able to modify the HTML, username and email enumeration, email bombing, HTTP request smuggling without any proven impact. So again, you're seeing this proven impact a lot. Homograph attacks, XML RPC enabled, banner grabbing, version disclosure, not stripping metadata of files, same site scripting, subdomain takeover without taking over the subdomain, arbitrary file upload without proof of existence of the uploaded file. And again, this is an important one. So let's say you find an insecure file upload, you're able to upload a PHP file, you upload a reverse shell. Well, if you're not able to find that reverse shell, maybe it's been named like a 64 hex character file name, maybe it's been put into a directory that you don't have access to or you don't know where it is. What's the security impact? Yeah, you've uploaded a file, but you're not exploiting it to actually do anything. Also, blind SSRF without proven impact. Again, we're seeing those keywords again, proven impact, and disclosed or misconfigured Google Maps API keys, and host header injection without proven business impact. Some general out of scope. So we talked about duplicates in a previous module. If the vulnerability has already been reported and was known to the company, it will be flagged as a duplicate. Only the first person to report the vulnerability will be awarded the bounty. Theoretical issues with no realistic exploit scenarios or attack surfaces, or issues that require complex end-user interactions. Spam, social engineering, and physical intrusion. We talked about that. The same with DDoS attacks or brute force attacks. Vulnerabilities that only work on software that no longer receives security updates. We talked about that as well. Attacks that require physical access to a victim's computer or device, man in the middle, compromised user accounts. Here's a good one. Recently discovered zero-day vulnerabilities found in in-scope assets within 14 days after a public release. So you have to allow companies some time to patch their software. In this case, they're allowing 14 days. So if there's a 0 day and they take more than 2 weeks to patch the software, then that is something probably worth reporting to them. Reports that state software is out of date or vulnerable, again, without a proof of concept. So we talked about that. If you find some vulnerable software, that's great. You might get a bounty if you prove you can exploit it. And any access to personal data which exceeds the options of obtaining proof for a certain vulnerability. So let's say you find an IDOR and you're able to access some other user's personal data. And rather than reporting that as a vulnerability, you then go and access the data for every user on the platform and then report that as a vulnerability. You have overstepped the line. You need to access the minimal amount of data required in order to demonstrate the impact of a vulnerability. Exploiting non-internet facing systems, which include any attacks that are conducted on the internal network of Redbull. So we talked a little about pivoting as well. If you gain access to a system and then you start poking around in the internal network, that is not only out of scope, but could result in legal consequences as well. Obviously, you should not install backdoors. That's very hard to argue is a non-malicious activity. And you shouldn't change any settings or delete anything or pursue vulnerabilities which send unsolicited bulk emails or spam. And that's it. There's our in and out of scope. You can see down at the bottom, they talk about the rewards, which are trays of Redbull. So if you get an exceptional, you get a surprise. You get critical, you get 6 trays of Redbull. So you may have seen posts on Twitter from people who have a big stack of Redbull crates in their garage, and this is probably how they got them. Alright, I just want to show another quick example, which is InnoGames, another public open program, and I want to show this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the Redbull program allowed us to view all of the domains that were in scope in that GitHub list, but that's not very common. Typically, this is what you'll see. So you'll see each domain that's in scope, and maybe you'll see some wildcards in here. Let's have a look at the out of scope as well. So you can see here, the contact form is out of scope. You're not allowed to brute force on the login. And a lot of the same stuff that we are going to see for the Redbull program and for most programs, you'll see down in the application section here. So again, no self-XSS that can't be used to exploit other users, no missing cookie flags and security headers. If you do enough bug bounty programs, you'll realize after a period of time that some of these will pretty much always be out of scope, and it won't take you long to assess what is in the scope for testing. I also wanted to show this just to remind people that bug bounty is not all web. There are a lot of games programs, and it's quite a niche area which has less researchers than web, although a lot of the games programs will also have websites and Android applications and things like that. And yeah, we also have mobile programs or programs that have a mobile aspect. We have smart contracts, sometimes hardware as well. So depending on what your area of expertise is or what skills you're trying to learn, hopefully you'll find something which is of interest. I'll just highlight here as well then that this one has a different automated tooling. So this is 1 request per second. And I believe this one has the bounty payout. Yeah, so here's our bounty table here. So you can see based on the CVSS score, which we talked about in another module, you can find out what you're likely to receive. So you can get up to 4K for an exceptional vulnerability on a tier 1 asset. So we go down here, we see we've got some tier 1 assets, we've got some tier 2, and maybe you want to spend your time focusing on the more expensive assets, or maybe you'll think that they get more attention from other researchers and that you want to focus on tier 2 assets for a slightly lower reward, but maybe a greater chance of finding a vulnerability. Anyway, I think this one's been quite a long video, so let's wrap it up here. A reminder that there is an Ask a Scope question here where you can ask a question about the scope. Unfortunately, we can't provide too much information a lot of the time, so it is on the researcher to read and understand the scope. We'll often try to help with specific questions, but it's not guaranteed that somebody at Intigriti will say, yes, this is in scope, please go ahead and test that, or no, this is out of scope. The onus is on the researcher basically to make sure that they properly read and interpret the scope as laid out on the website. However, if there's a mistake in that scope, or if there's something missing or it needs clarification, then the Ask a Scope question is definitely a good option.